The Morningside pattern offers both dress and shirt styles with 2 sleeve options. All views features a narrow collar, concealed placket, and slightly dropped shoulders. Style A has a classic cuffed sleeve for a versatile wardrobe workhorse. Style A features a pleat in the back. Style B has flounced sleeves for a more whimsical silhouette. Style B also features a gathered back. The dress has a roomy fit, inseam pockets, and a curved high-low hemline. Determine your size by looking at the size chart and taking your measurements. Then look at the finished garment measurements and determine how much ease you would like in your garment. For style A, you can use any light to medium weight woven fabrics, such as viscose or chambray. Use drapier fabrics for style B. Remember, the stiffer or heavier your fabric is, the more volume your flounce will have. So if you want your flounced sleeves to drape nicely, use a drapey fabric. I'm using this beautiful drapey viscose. As soon as my fabric comes home, it goes into the washing machine. Once it's dry, I immediately iron it and then I hang it on a hanger in a section in my wardrobe. This way, whenever I want to sew, it's already washed, dried and ironed and ready for me to use. If you're using a drapier fabric, try cutting out the front placket slit after you've interfaced it. I'm placing my front on the fold and then I'm going to mark where the front slit needs to go. I've cut out the interfacing according to the pattern piece, but I've not cut out the slit yet. I'm fusing this piece to the front and then I'm remarking where the slit needs to go. Now I can confidently cut out the slit without the danger of my fabric stretching. Alternately, you can simply use the fold of the fabric to place your interfacing instead of marking it out. To interface my collar, I like to take a piece of fabric big enough for my collar and collar stand and then interface the entire piece of fabric. This way is much easier and accurate. Then simply cut out a collar and a collar stand out of your interfaced fabric. Make tiny notches to mark the centers. This will make sewing later much easier, and don't forget to mark your notches on your collar stand. Moving on to the button plackets. To achieve a crisper fold, you could extend your interfacing by 1 centimeter past the fold line. In the case of the right placket, you're going to extend it by fold line 1, 2 and 3, which means you can just interface that entire section if you wish to do so. Make sure that your plackets are orientated the same as this illustration. This illustration shows you the wrong side of the fabric. There is a top and a bottom to this placket. As you can see, the top has got little grooves and the bottom is straight. So I've cut out a piece of interfacing to go over all of those fold lines and extend by 1 centimeter over fold line 3, and now I'm cutting it out and remarking those fold lines. This will be fixed on an updated pattern, but as you can see, the shaded area on the pattern piece is on the wrong side. So if you want your left placket to represent the illustration, you need to cut it out on the right side of the fabric. If you're cutting it out on the wrong side, simply flip it over. This will ensure that the correct part of your placket is interfaced and your placket is upright. If you don't wish to extend your interfacing over your fold lines, this is what your pieces will look like. This way has the benefit of giving you very defined fold lines, which makes the placket easier to fold. When cutting out the rest of your pattern pieces, make sure to mark all the markings as well as all the notches on your pattern pieces. If you haven't changed your needle in a while, set yourself up for success by using a nice, sharp new needle. Stay stitch your necklines by stitching within the seam allowance. Start at your shoulder seams and work towards the middle. This will stabilize your necklines and ensure that they do not stretch. To prevent stretching your fabric while you are sewing, slightly push it towards the needle. Using a fabric marker, mark out a 1 centimeter line towards the bottom of your placket opening. We will be reinforcing this bottom area. I'm using a stitch length of about 2 and then I'm taking it down to a 1 when I'm reaching the corners. This allows extra reinforcement, especially because we're going to be cutting very near to those stitches. Now cut to but not through the corner stitches. Take the line underneath fold line 3 and press this up with your iron. Now take fold line 1 and press it down towards the wrong side. We are now going to take the top of the placket and meet fold line 1 with fold line 3. You'll see the top curves fit nicely into each other. Now fold line 3 towards the wrong side. Remember, this piece is interfaced, so don't use steam. The top of the placket will extend slightly over the bottom. Now take this placket piece and put it on the right side of your shirt. Right side's facing, we're going to be pinning it and then sewing it. We are going to use a normal stitch length of 2.5 and sew it at a 1 centimeter seam allowance up until that little point. To make our seam lie beautifully flat, we're going to first iron the seam open. Then we're going to iron the seam allowance towards the placket. Now we can fold the placket over till just beyond that stitch line. You can choose whether you want to top stitch or stitch in the ditch. Whichever one you choose, you're going to do it right up until that point again. You can go ahead and pin this. Or if you like your placket to lie more flat while you're sewing, you can hand baste it. This is just a series of large running stitches to hold the fabric in place while you sew. I'll be demonstrating both stitching in the ditch and edge stitching. On this piece I'm edge stitching. I like to think of this as needle width. So if you think to yourself the width of your sewing needle away from the edge. If you imagine that needle width while you're sewing, it's easy to keep it on track. Now remember to stop at that exact point again. Here I'm just removing my basting stitches. Fold your placket pattern at the buttonhole markings and use this as a template to mark your buttonholes. I'm making sure that they're all the same distance from the fold. It's going to be much easier sewing your buttonholes on your machine now while the placket is still unattached at the bottom. Using your individual sewing machine's manual, make your buttonholes. Now let's move on to the left placket. Press up the line that is on the uninterfaced edge. Now take the other edge and line it up with your placket opening. We're going to pin and sew this again in the same way as we did the right hand placket. Match up your plackets and make sure the overlay at the bottom is the same size. Now this time I'm sewing from the wrong side, which is much easier because I can see exactly where those reinforcement stitches are and exactly where that point is. Now give the placket a really nice press. Remember, we're still not using steam because we're working with interfacing. Now if you wish to stitch in the ditch, find a focal point on your presser foot. You're going to want to look at this point while you're sewing and not at your needle. If you find that point that perfectly aligns with your sewing needle on your presser foot, then look at that point. If you look at your needle going up and down, it might make you feel dizzy. If you watch my right hand, I'm constantly flattening that fabric. If you don't do this, sometimes the band can twist while you are sewing. Make sure your placket with the buttonholes lies face down first, and then your left placket on the top. Pin this in place, and now we're going to sew from the one point to the other point. Make sure your plackets are lying correctly before you do the stitching. Trim that edge and then overlock it, leaving tails to weave in. Now take those tails and weave them in to ensure that they don't unravel. To open your buttonholes, you can use this buttonhole cutter. It gives a really nice clean cut. Be sure to use a self-healing cutting mat. Alternately, you can use a seam ripper. Just place a pin at the end to be sure that you don't rip further than you intend. You can use the scissors to cut that last little bit. Working on the right side of the fabric, stitch 2 parallel lines between the dots on the back body piece using a long stitch length. Now place your back right sides facing with one of your back yoke pieces. Pin each side up until the dot. I'm just securing my bobbin threads here to come back to it later. Now I'm pinning this side up until the dot. I'm going to determine the center of my yoke piece, as well as the center of my back piece. Placing these two centers together, I'll be sure to have an even gather on either side. Now taking the bobbin threads, I'm going to be gathering this section until it's the same size as the back yoke. When you're happy with it, secure those bobbin threads and then distribute the gathers evenly. Now do the same on the other side. Using your 1 cm seam allowance and a normal stitch length of 2.5, stitch this seam. I'm using an awl to help me even out the gathers as I sew over them. You can remove the bottom row of gathering stitches now. Leave in the gathering stitches that are in the seam allowance. This allows those gathers to stay together and not to flare out. We will complete our yoke in an upcoming section. To sew our back pleat, mark out about 5 cm down with your fabric marker from each notch. These notches are on your pattern piece close to the center of your back body piece. Now with right sides together, fold your back in half and pin that line. Make sure that your pin comes out at the same spot on the front and the back. As you can see, I have to adjust the back slightly so the two lines can perfectly align. Now with a long basting stitch length, we're going to baste this line. Laying your back piece open, take that center back fold and line it up with the line that we just sewed. You can now press and baste your pleat in place. Make sure that there are no tucks or folds underneath. Now with right sides facing, pin your back body piece to the bottom of one of your back yoke pieces. Pin the sides and the centers and then pin each section. Stitch the seam with a normal 2.5 stitch length and 1 cm seam allowance. Make sure that your pleat is lying flat before sewing over it. Place the right side of your other back yoke to the wrong side of your garment. These two yokes will enclose that back yoke seam. Pin the sides and the center and then in between. You can now use your previous line of stitching as a guide. Press your back yokes up on both sides. Try not to crush your gathering with your iron. To reduce bulk, we're going to grade the seam allowance. When you're grading seam allowances, always cut the seam allowance on the side of the wrong side the shortest. This leaves a cleaner look on the right side of your garment. Cut your seam allowances in staggered lengths. So as you can see, the seam allowances that are facing towards the right side is smooth and the back is cut. With wrong sides facing each other, place the front and the back of your garment together. We are going to pin the shoulder seams, wrong sides together, but only with that one yoke piece. We are going to leave the other yoke piece unattached for now. I'm keeping these two layers together by stitching it with a 6mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we are going to fully enclose those shoulder seams by using what's called the burrito method. I'm just straightening out my garment here so that it's easier to roll up. Lay your garment right sides out, and with the top facing you, you're going to start at the bottom and you're going to make a tight roll. So I'm taking the back and the front of the garment together and rolling it up. Now when you get towards the top, you're going to want to leave that back yoke unattached. Once you've rolled it up into the yoke area, you're going to take that other back yoke and flip it over to meet the shoulder seams. We are now going to pin the shoulder seams together, making sure not to catch any of that extra rolled up fabric within the seam. Sew the seam at a 1 cm seam allowance with a normal stitch length. Make sure not to catch any of that rolled up fabric in your seam. Once again, we will be grading these seam allowances, so we're cutting the shortest side towards the back yoke. Take your rolled up fabric and gently pull it through the neck opening. Give your shoulder seams a good press on both the right and the wrong sides. Mark a line between the two notches on the ends of your collar stands. Place your collar pieces right sides together and pin them. Remember, these two pieces are going to behave differently. The one is stabilized with interfacing, the other one isn't. We will be addressing any discrepancies between them after we've sewn the collar. It's a good idea to mark your pivot point at the corner. Measure 1 centimeter from either edge, and that's the point that you're going to pivot at. To reinforce the corners, use a stitch length of 1. We will be cutting very close to these corners, so this is important. Sew a line of stitching at 1 centimeter at the bottom edge of your collar stand. We will be using this as a guide to press up the seam allowance. When you press up the seam allowance, make sure you can see that line of stitching so that it's not visible on the right side. Grade your collar seam allowance and then cut the points. Now turn your collar right side out, being gentle with those points. Use a point turner to push it out, or if you don't have one, use a pin, but just be gentle. You're going to have to roll and manipulate this fabric now, so if you find that your hands are too dry, then you can use the spray function on your iron and spray some water onto your fingertips. This will really help in manipulating the fabric. Slightly roll back the uninterfaced side of the collar, so that on the right side it has a very smooth appearance. When it comes to the top of the collar, you'll find that the fabric likes to bunch up and fold. So what I like to do is I like to first press open that seam as much as possible, and that helps it to lie really flat. This is going to make it very easy to roll over. Give your collar a final good press, and remember this is interfaced, so we're not using steam. We can now address any discrepancy between those two fabrics. Just trim away the excess to make it nice and even. Pin and baste these edges within the seam allowance. have my collar uninterfaced side facing up. Then I'm taking the right side of my interfaced collar stand and lining up that line that we made so that the notch perfectly aligns with the edge of my collar. This is where those little center snips we made on our collar pieces come in very handy. Sew the collar to the collar stand between these notches. It's always easier to sew with the interfacing side facing towards you. The fabrics just feed easier this way. We are now going to line up and pin the uninterfaced collar stand. It's very easy to misjudge the angle of this curve, so it's a good idea to mark out your 1 cm seam allowance along this curve. Once again, to reinforce this area, we're going to sew at a stitch length of 1. If you find your uninterfaced fabric is growing faster than your bottom interfaced fabric, simply place your thumb under the fabric and pull it up slightly. This allows the fabrics to feed at the same rate. We are going to need to trim those corners to make them lie flat. I like to use a pinking shears. If you don't have a pinking shears, you can just use a scissors. Give your collar stand a good press. Pin the right side of your interfaced collar stand to the right side of your neckline. Determine the center of your back yoke and match that up with the center notch we made on the collar stand. As you're sewing this, you're going to constantly adjust the position of the main garment. If you don't do this, you'll encounter tucks and pleats as you go along. Remember, we are working with a neckline curve. Press the seam allowance up towards the collar stand. Now pin the collar stand down, making sure to cover that row of stitching. You can either edge stitch this stitch, or I like to hand stitch it close for a cleaner look. I like to take about 5 mm of the collar stand fold. And then I like to take the needle under the stitch and grab a tiny bit of the seam allowance. If you grab a bit of the main fabric, it makes little pin pricks on the other side. When it comes to the two yoke layers, you can just grab a bit of that inside yoke. Now again on the other side, I'm grabbing a little bit of that seam allowance. Every few stitches just give the thread a tug, and that makes it nice and snug. I love the clean look that this gives to the collar. Onto the hem. We're going to be finishing off the hems separately. Sew a line of basting stitches at 1.5 centimeters. Use that as a guide to press up the fabric twice. First to the stitch line, and then up again. Make sure you can just see that line of stitching on the wrong side. Depending on how delicate your fabric is, once you remove those basting stitches, there might still be tiny pinprick holes left. Now we're going to pin and edge stitch that hem in place. We're going to be doing the same for the front and the back hems. As you can see, it's a bit wobbly, so just give it a bit of steam and that sorts it right out. Now you can go ahead and remove those basting stitches. To easily mark your pocket, simply cut out on the stitch line for your size on your main pattern piece. Then you can just go ahead and take chalk or fabric marker, whichever shows up on your fabric. I'm using white chalk because that will show up better on this black fabric, and mark out that stitch line. Overlock or finish the edges of your pocket pieces. You're going to do the same on all 4 your pocket pieces. Overlock the 3 sides, leaving the side seam side of your pocket pieces unfinished. Weave in your overlocking ends. If you're working with a very drapey fabric, you might want to just double check with your pattern piece that your piece is still the right shape. I like to iron together my pairs of pockets so that they're exactly the same size. Now I'm laying my pocket right sides together with my dress. And then I'm going to be pinning the edge because that's the edge that we're going to sew down now. I'm also going to be placing some other pins just to hold the pocket in place so that it doesn't flap about while I'm sewing. To get an exact mirror image of the placement of your pocket pieces on your front and your back, simply place your pocket pieces on top of each other with the right side facing you, and then place the back of your garment, lining up the side seams and those side notches perfectly. Now you know your pockets are going to line up perfectly when you go to sew it together. So take that top pocket piece along with your side seam and pin those together. Sew your pockets to your garment at a 1 cm seam allowance. And then overlock or finish all 4 of your side seams individually. We are now going to understitch that pocket piece, so make sure that it's a nice crisp clean edge. Sew close to the edge on the pocket side of the garment, making sure that you're catching the seam allowance together with the pocket. We are now going to sew the side seams, including the pocket, all in one go. Now we're going to mark out about 5 centimeters going up along the side. So I'm marking the 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then I'm marking a line of 5 centimeters. So we're going to sew up and then down again. Give your pocket a good press, and then we're going to line it up with a stitch line. I'm just going to be pinning my pocket in place so that it's easier to handle when I'm busy on the right side. Now, feeling that the pocket is lying in the right position, I'm going to be pinning it along that stitch line. I'm sewing it just within that stitch line that I marked, just to make sure that I am catching the pocket. This is a really comfortable way of doing a pocket because it doesn't flap around on the inside of your dress. Sew and finish the side seam of your sleeve pieces and then press it towards the back. Sew up the side of your cuffs with the same 1 cm seam allowance and then press that seam open. Sew a line of basting stitches 1 cm from the one side of each of your cuffs. Use that as a guide to press up the raw edge. We are now going to sew the unpressed side of the cuff to the bottom of the sleeve, so match up those seams that we just sewed, and then with right sides together we're going to match up those 2 raw edges. With your extension table removed on your sewing machine, sew this at a 1 cm seam allowance. Press the seam allowances towards the cuff, both from the wrong and the right side, to get a nice crisp edge. Now fold over the cuff towards the inside. Take that folded edge and place it just beyond the stitching line. We are going to be sewing from the right side, so transfer those pins to the right side. Edge stitch or stitch in the ditch. Make sure you caught everything on the wrong side. Now with right sides together, we're going to pin that sleeve piece into the body. So line up the sleeve seam with the side seam of your body, and then the shoulder notch on the yokes with the shoulder notch on your sleeve, and then pin in between. There's also a notch indicating the front. Sew this all the way around with a 1 cm seam allowance and then finish off the raw edges. Give your cuff a good press and then we're going to turn it up. I'm matching up those bottom seams and then I'm just doing a very quick and easy little catch stitch. I'm going to be doing the same little catch stitch on the shoulder. You've got 2 little dots marked on your sleeve cap, so you're going to do 2 rows of gathering stitches in between those 2 dots. So the one row is going to be at about 5 mm and the other row at about 1.5 mm. Remember, for gathering we use our longest stitch length and we leave long tails without back stitching. Now we're going to close off that sleeve by sewing the side seams and finishing the raw edge. Sew a line of stitches at 1.5 cm along the hem of each sleeve. Just like with the main body hem, we're going to be using this as a guide to press up the hem. Now press up the hem to meet that line of stitching. And then press it up again, making sure you can still see that line of stitching on the wrong side. This little area where your sleeve seam meets your hem is going to be very bulky, so simply snip off that seam allowance and then refold it. Now pin and edge stitch both sleeve hems. Pin, sew and finish the edges of both your side seams. Line up your hems at the 1 cm mark to get a nice smooth hem. Press each side seam towards the back. Weave in your overlocking tails. With a hand sewing needle and thread, stitch your seam allowance to your hem allowance. This will help it to lie nice and flat and give a smooth appearance. Now we can attach the sleeves to the body. Line up the seams and then line up the side front notch as well as the shoulder notches. Using the bobbin threads, gather the sleeve head to fit into the armhole. This is a gathered sleeve, so we are not going to be easing in these gathers like we would for a set-in sleeve. Make sure your gathers are nice and even, and when you're happy with it, pin it in place. Sew all the way around with a 1 cm seam allowance, using your awl if you need to help you to get the gathers nice and even as you sew. It's easier to finish off the raw edges with the gathering stitches still in place. You can now remove the other row of gathering stitches and then give your sleeve a good press, trying not to crush your gathers. Use your buttonholes to mark your button placements. I'm just double checking them by making sure that they're all the same distance from the edge. I'm using a doubled up thread to sew on my button, so I'm first making 1 stitch and then I'm using a button spacer and sewing in the remaining stitches. So a button spacer just needs to basically be the thickness of the button band that's going to go underneath your button. So you can also use a needle, just a thick needle, or a toothpick or whatever you can find. Then you're going to come up underneath it and wrap it around a couple of times. And then secure it with a knot at the back. If you're using a particularly drapey or delicate fabric, you might find that the top of your hidden button placket is gaping a bit. If this bothers you, then you can just tuck it in place. To do this, you will simply go between the buttons and stitch it on the inside with a little tuck stitch. You want to grab the inside of the fabric so that it doesn't show on the outside. You are sewing the top of the hidden placket to the band that has got the buttonholes on. So you're not sewing it to that left placket that has the buttons on. And as you can see, your buttons will still fully function, but those 2 layers are held together between the buttons. If you wish to button up right to your collar, you can make a horizontal buttonhole and sew a button onto your collar stand.